This is one of the first ones I learned from Shamdas. Gopala, Gopala, Devaki Nandana Gopala, Devaki Nandana Gopala, Devaki Nandana Gopala. Like it because it's simple, gets to the point, and it talks about an idea of God and his mom. So no matter how big things, gross things, horrible things get, God still has a mom and has to be put to bed and gets in trouble, and it's a nice idea for me to remind myself.
Sweet. Thank you so much. We are here today with Jules Febre.
Hello.
Jules, so nice to have you here.
Nice to be here.
Let's go to the table.
All right, let's do it.
You just mentioned, I was really curious because you just mentioned that you experienced like Shamdas, Swami Nirmalananda and Patabi Joyce. How was this experience for you? I mean, any of us could dream of it, like, oh, okay, these legends, and you've been with them.
Yeah. Let's see. Maybe it's important to first say that I was 13 when I saw them. And I was coming from New York City, which means I grew up pre going to India in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And essentially, what was it like meeting them? Some of it is, with retrospect, of course, it was great. It was amazing. Oh my gosh, I got this wonderful opportunity. When I was there, I was not aware of how great it was. And my main memories of those months, so I went to India when I was 13 and I spent 3 months there, 2 months in Mysore and a month in northern India, which is a place called Bruj, which is Govardhan Hill and Vrindavan and things like this. And I spent 2 months doing the early shift of Ashtanga yoga with Patabi Joyce. And this is probably 1995. So still in what some people would call the old shala. It's a very small room. I can't remember how many people fit there. 12 people or something like this. But really, my memories of that time is I met a guy in the little, I think it was called the Covery Lodge was the place that we stayed. And there was like a old school hippie guy who lived there who had a giant bag of weed. And so I went every day on the roof, unbeknownst to my uncle David, who took me to India at this time, and I would smoke a bunch of weed in the morning with this, like, I don't know, like guy in his 60s, which at the time I thought, oh wow, this is so cool. But looking back, I'm like, oh, a 13-year-old boy from New York smoking weed with like a 60-year-old guy. I don't even know where he was from. That was a little bit strange. So there were a few moments kind of like that where it was a little bit what I would consider kind of the wild, wild west. Still a time where certain parts of the world for Westerners were pretty unknown and only the really adventurous went there or the very brave. And so there was still this element of like, I don't know, by the time you're 13, you're a man now, like you're going through your trials and tribulations to enter the clan. And I have, like if I think of one memory from each of these three places, 2 months with Patabi Joyce, some time with Swami Nirmalananda, and some time with Shamdas. With Patabi Joyce, I just remember him standing on each of my legs in Baddha Konasana. Yeah. So I'm a relatively small person in general. I was even smaller at 13. And Patabi Joyce wasn't known for his petite frame. So he just stood, one foot on one thigh, the other foot on the other thigh, and squished me down and would say, breathe, crushed me. So this is like my practice memory. Swami Nirmalananda, his place, his ashram was a really wild place. You could walk around and still there were wild elephants and leopards and such beauty. And so that's one of the things I really remember about his place. He was a Mauni. He was not speaking. He only wrote on a chalkboard. Although David and I disagree. I thought I remembered him speaking. He said when I was there, he was still silent. And he would have been towards the end of his silence, 13 years. Maybe he was just sneaking and speaking to me when nobody else was looking. And this was probably one of the more profound of the moments in India of being in such a wild place. And also unguarded. Like I just kind of walked around and you could easily come across elephant dung on the floor, or we were on a bus coming in. We went twice and we were coming up on a bus and there was a leopard on the side of the road sunning himself. Yeah, so to be in a place like this after being in the concrete jungle to an actual jungle was pretty beautiful. And then with Shamdas in North, it's probably true for most young people, teenagers perhaps particularly, where their struggle is the most and intense, profound struggle of anybody who's ever struggled. And I meet a lot of people who come to a yoga class and they're interested in getting their nephew, niece, son, daughter into yoga, and they say, "Oh, I know you started yoga when you were young," and because I started practicing maybe around 6 years old.
Oh, wow.
And say, what time should we start? And I'm not so sure that for me that was an approach that was helpful. I did it because it's what people were doing and what people were modeling, not because it's what I thought that I should do because somebody else thought it was helpful. I did it because I had an aunt, an uncle, my mom, and more than anything else, Jivamukti in the late 80s and early 90s, when I was becoming more cognizant of what it was really a community space. There were people chanting, which was super weird compared to what I was doing in my day-to-day life, but it was filled with happy people. And that was what stuck out to me. And when I got to India, it's a really rough and wild place. And all of the suffering that I thought was so intense and pure and righteous. And also, my dad's from Puerto Rico and he was given up for adoption at a very young age. And he had his own troubles that bled into my life. And I thought, I have this difficult. And then I went to a place where people had a hard time eating or sleeping. And I definitely rejected a lot of it in the beginning until I got toward Shamdas. And Shamdas was this mix of the wildness of Swami Nirmalananda's mixed with some of the rules and guidelines and structure of what I experienced with Pattabhi Jois in Mysore. I mean, there's no running water, definitely no warm water. So cold bucket baths that you get from the well. If you cooked, it's because you had a cow dung fire. And all of that was super cool, but he still was going to temple and chanting and going to the Yamuna River and hanging out with monkeys. So there was this beauty of aestheticism, kind of this rugged, naturalistic idea of a yogi. Not quite a cave, but not an apartment either. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, so the breakthrough for me there was like being able to cook my own food and still kind of have this childlike ability to play with the fire and be by the river. Yeah.
Nice. Sounds amazing. And then you went back to New York, and what happened then? I heard that you went out of yoga again for quite some time, and then came back.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty fair way of saying it. So again, I was growing up in the Lower East Side. which for those of us who don't know, in the 80s was a relatively, I would say, rough place from New York, even from New York standards. So the building I grew up in was on this 4th Street and Avenue D, and many of the buildings around us were either what we'd call the projects, or I don't know, what would the name in Germany be? Like in England they would say council flats.
Sozialwohnung.
Yeah, Sozialwohnung. And you know, they're big. They're like 12 stories, and they're like these gigantic monstrosities. So we lived right across the street from them, which means we didn't really have any government support, but we had the same poverty. And so in the building that we lived in, the apartment that we lived in, that floor, we were the only apartment that was occupied. All the other apartments were burned out and abandoned, and they were closed with like a chain and a lock around the door.
Police or something like that?
From the landlord, probably, or the police. And then above us, that apartment, I remember being empty. And then there was a family above us there. But like each floor, there was only like 1 or 2 people that lived on each floor. And then a lot of the buildings around us were either abandoned, burnt out, or just like not safe to go in. And this is where a lot of the punk movement starts, because a lot of the punk movement in New York City, they used to play in squats, like where people just moved into the building and took it over, and they'd have these hardcore punk shows, like the Cro-Mags or things like this, right? So they were known for playing Tompkins Square Park and a lot of the squats so this is the neighborhood that I grew up in. And then you kind of have to be rough. And then I got to India and I was like, oh, maybe I'm not as rough as I thought, or I'm rough in a different way. And then when I came back, I was like, fuck that. I don't want to have anything to do with yoga. Actually, I really enjoy this relative privilege that I have and the relative comfort that I have. It might not be as intense suffering as I thought, but it's still particular to it's interesting how much we can attach ourselves and how ego defining our challenges and suffering is, and how joy can bring us together. And that can be kind of a scary thing for me, at least at that time. So basically I came back. One of the rules and regulations of going to India was that I needed to be vegetarian for the whole trip, which I wasn't before. And the day that I came back, I had a bacon cheeseburger. And I was like, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do vegetarian. I don't want to do yoga. I don't want to have anything to do with this. And so, yeah, for a number of years, I just said, no, thanks, and stopped going.
Okay. And how did you find your way back to it?
You would say I took the long road, the circuitous route. How did I find my way back to it? I think the first, all this time, Jivamukti, and maybe it's helpful for me to say, the aunt and uncle of mine who were into yoga are Sharon Gannon and David Life, who are the co-founders of Jivamukti. And Jivamukti, I would say, is probably very instrumental, if not one of the more instrumental, what we would say now, transnational forms of yoga, to really bring an integrated approach to the West when it comes to incorporating asana steeped in a moral and ethical conduct with the other elements that are sometimes separated, like jnana yoga or bhakti yoga. And because of who they were, which previous to this, they were, classically trained as artists, Sharon as a dancer and David in fine arts. So they brought that type of artist raised throughout the 60s mentality to yoga. Not only their approach, but who they were as people attracted this very eclectic group of people, particularly in the Lower East Side of New York, which was as most places that are kind of burnt out and decrepit, they become a haven for artists because you can get a lot of space for relatively cheap. So you get poets and painters and dancers.
It's like the fabric of any wall, something like that.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And I think that's why Berlin was very, received a lot of international acclaim, because you could have these beautiful spaces for relatively cheap in a centrally located space. And so there's something to that also. So it's not just who they were, but it's where they were and the time that they were. And they had a lot of famous people coming, essentially. So even though that was happening, I was still separate from it until I was in high school. So 13 to 17-ish, let's say. 13 to 16, 17. I would still see them from time to time, but not so much. And part of my work at high school at this time was I needed to find a placement. We called it community service. They prefer a nonprofit, but it doesn't really matter. It could be anything that's non-traditional. So you couldn't find a place at the Gap or Banana Republic or something like this. So they wanted you to spend a certain amount of unpaid hours a week in a location that was non-traditional. And I just thought the easiest, least work that I had to do was get a placement at Jivamukti. And so I reached out to them, and they put me in touch with the person who was managing at the time, Carlos Menjavor. And Carlos was like, yeah, come through. You know, it was Wednesdays from during school hours, right? So 12 to 3. And so my first trip back to the world of yoga had nothing to do with taking class or being inspired or finding deep insight. I did the least amount of work to find a community placement, community service placement. And did you see what old school yoga mats used to come? How they used to come?
Rattan.
Big roll, right? Originally from Germany, I think.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think originally from Germany. BKS Iyengar was on a tour, maybe in the 70s or in the 80s, and he came through Germany, and he was doing something in like a conference hall or something, and it was so hard, and he asked somebody for a mat, and the only thing that was available was this little cushion that goes under a carpet. And so original yoga mats were these big rolls that were originally meant, I think, to be under carpeting from a German manufacturer. And so what I did for like 3 hours was I would take these giant rolls and I would measure them out at essentially 2 meters and cut them. And that's what I did. Blue, purple, green. Yeah. And so that's how I began to find my way back to yoga. And then it slowly started to have other unforeseen effects.
So, and then you cut these rolls, and then when was the moment you wanted to practice on these rolls again after having been cut into the right piece for practice?
Yeah. I think, again, it was a little bit the same as I mentioned before. Just being around people who were genuinely enjoyable. And not only being around people that were genuinely enjoyable, but a space that allowed that to happen. And I think that aspect is missing from a lot of yoga schools these days. Maybe there's a couch. Maybe there's a place even you can get a glass of water for free or something. But there's not a place for people to come together outside paying a price to move. And Jivamukti was on Lafayette at this time when I was there. And there was a meditation room that you could go in and use at any time during the day. You didn't need to pay anything.
So the classes have been in another room, and
there was their own separate meditation temple that was anybody could come at any time and use. There were a lot of benches, and people would often come really early before class and just kind of hang out and talk to people. The teachers, there was a kitchen. There was a little kitchen. So a lot of times the teachers would come early and have their food in the kitchen. So they would heat their food up or they would eat. And so I was always around people who were showing up to yoga not because they only wanted the 90-minute sweat. The 90-minute sweat was a good part of it, but they were really there because they had respect for the teacher and they wanted a relationship with the teacher. They were there because they had a respect for their fellow practitioners and they cultivated those relationships because it was a meaningful part of their life. People really scheduled their life around coming to yoga. And so even somebody like me, kind of a somewhat, I think rebellious is not quite the right word, but somebody who had a foot in both worlds, kind of hanging out and being in the streets and hanging out and being around these yogis and being able to recognize, at least in some limited fashion, what they were experiencing. So, which one would I prefer to do? And perhaps, I was also lucky that there weren't so many screens available to me at this time. And I just started practicing because I wanted to be around some of these people and maybe even show off a little bit, like, oh, hey, look what I can do. And I can lift myself up and I can jump through and I can go to a handstand. And sometimes within a yoga practice, I think that's seen a little bit as less than, like, oh, we don't want to attach ourselves to the ego. But David G often would make it so, like, you can't offering things that you haven't really worked on. Not like work on your ego a little bit, like get good at something and then offer it up. I offer my physical practice. Well, you don't really have one to give up, let's say. So there was something beautiful about being able to share the space with people. And I didn't do much of it, but it started to bleed into my life and my daily activities. And then I started to work there full time, which means I had even more interaction with people and I practiced a little bit more. And then at a certain point, I got arrested for armed robbery because I was still hanging out in the streets.
So it was always like a pulling from this world into this world, like in between.
Yeah, definitely pulling. And where I found the most joy and a little bit like where it was the easiest.
And also kind of an excitement of this world.
Yeah, I mean, for sure there's an excitement in both, but it's helpful to imagine, like, I'm not going to school with the people who are at yoga. So I enjoy them, but there aren't a lot of broke people practicing yoga, right? So there is a connection, but there's also an economic divide often. And if it weren't for yoga, I probably would never have met or been in the same room as many of these people. But the people who were always there when I left work, the people who were there when I woke up in the morning, these are the people that I see every day. These are the people who are there on my day off. And those are the people that I've been seeing for years. And I have very deep and interpenetrating relationships with, like, I know their parents, they know my parents. And my dad was still kind of hanging out and doing his thing like he was a teenager. So that was always there. And so I think the pull perhaps isn't how I would describe it, but just the attachment and the level of comfort and the excitement, like you said, definitely the excitement. And so one day a couple of my friends were like, hey, you want to do this robbery? And I was like, yeah, sure.
So like a real plan.
Yeah. I mean, it was something they did often. You trust people who are professionals at what they do.
It's robbery day.
Yeah. We know we're gonna go, and so long story short, I'm in a holding cell, and I just was sitting there, and it doesn't matter how big you are, how old you are. Once you're over 16, you're in the same place. Doesn't matter if you were littering or if you smoked a joint or if you shot somebody, you end up in the same place, all in the same place. And it's in some ways like you might see on television. So it's a little bit overcrowded. It's aggressive, it's violent, it doesn't feel safe. And I'm having a little bit of a panic attack because depending, it looks like I could face 3 to 6 years or 1 to 3 years of jail time. And I'm sitting there and just there's a chant within the Jivamukti tradition based on a prayer of Saint Francis of Assisi where he says, well, the version that we use is, make me an instrument for thy will, not mine, but thine be done. Free me from anger, jealousy, and fear. Fill my heart with joy and compassion. And as a mantra is supposed to do, like a mantra, that which protects the mind or overcomes the mind or helps you to cross the mind, it just kicked in on its own in a place of need because I had been exposed to it before. And it just kept repeating in my mind. And I resisted it really strongly at first because I thought, this is not the internal environment I need to cultivate right now. The internal environment I need to cultivate is strength, toughness, and defense, aggression, violence. But it just kept coming. And it made me reflect on some of what we have already talked about. What was appealing about staying with my friends who I'd known all my life? Oh, a sense of belonging, a sense of camaraderie, a sense of being seen and recognized for, and being good at something. And I realized I could also do that in yoga, and that I was doing that in yoga. And it must be, I don't remember so clearly, but I must have been more heavily invested by this time in the practice. I'm 17-ish around this time. And so I must have been more invested in the practice and a little bit also the prestige. A lot of times people do things not just to be seen because of also the prestige that comes along with it, because then it gives you the money to dress a certain way. And if you dress a certain way, then your social currency is stronger. And so I realized, I could do all of those things with a yoga practice in a way that was sustainable, kind, caring, safe, and more mutually beneficial. And it wasn't so much of an intellectual understanding. It was more like a visual images kind of just clicked into place. And at that moment, I decided, okay, if I stay here, I'm still gonna go the yoga direction. And if I get out of here, I'm still gonna go the yoga direction. Whatever shape that takes, that's the thing that I'm gonna do.
Oh, beautiful. And then they needed to decide how much you get and stuff like that, or
yeah. So okay, so I didn't have any money, so I had a public defender. So the court gives you one, right? When they read you your rights. If you do not have attorney, or if you cannot afford one will be provided for you. Yeah. So I got out of because I was still relatively young. It was my first violent crime. I had been arrested before, but it wasn't a violent crime. And so they let you out, and then they give you a court date of when you come back. And I had a public defender, and I went back and forth to court a couple of times. My mom found a youth development program. Essentially, it's a probation program. So you get to know them, they get to know you. And if you agree together, they advocate on your behalf with the lawyer so that you get a reduced sentence.
Okay.
So, but you still have to go to court. And it depends on the level of intensity that the prosecutor wants to prosecute your case and how strong the evidence is and how wrong the victim was and how much violence there was. And so in my case, we were relatively fortunate. My friends and I, one of them had a gun, a 9mm, and he held out the gun and the person gave up their things and that was the end of it. And then we ran away and we got arrested later, but nobody was harmed. So that was helpful for us. I was under 18, which was helpful for me. I get a lesser sentence. And so eventually I got sentenced to 5 years probation, which is the maximum amount you can get. And then the next level would be jail. So, which would have been 1 to 3 years. And so luckily I got 5 years of probation, which essentially means I have to go every single day to this probation program, which then was called Andrew Glover. So I go to school, and then after school, I go to a probation program.
For how many hours?
From 3 to 7, 7:30.
Wow. Okay, so it's the whole afternoon, actually.
Yeah. And then you have to go home. And this is the time of beepers, right? So then I had to beep my counselor, and the counselor calls my home to speak to somebody else in my home that she knows. My mom I had a single mom. She would have to speak to my mom to be sure that I was there.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
Or, like, you beep and she has to know the number that you're beeping her from. Like, it has to be your home number. So I did that Monday through Friday. And then once a week in the beginning, and then later once a month, I had to go also to a probation officer. And this is somebody who works for the court system for the city. And they drug test you. They want to see that you're working, that you're like a productive member of society, that you haven't been arrested. Because during this 5-year probation, if you're arrested again, all of the kind of good things that they gave you, instead of going to jail, you get probation, all of that's taken away and you get a harsher sentence.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was, and somehow I still found a little bit of time for yoga in them.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. And so what a journey, right? And so, and then then you started somehow to teach. How went that on? So how did you find you practice yoga, but when was the time that you found yourself in the role of kind of, I'm going to teach yoga?
That still took a little while. I started practicing more. Eventually, probation, you see the officer once a week, then once a month, and maybe every other month. And then the probation, then the youth development program, they're like, okay, you're working, so you can't come at this time, you can't come at that time, still beep us. But eventually everything starts to fade out a little bit, and yoga started to fade in more. And then I finished high school and started to go to university. I went to this place called Hunter College. And I had saved up enough money to go for a number of years, like not enough to do the full thing, but to start the first 2-3 years. And in my second or third year, maybe at the end of my second year, beginning of my third year, I was still working full-time at Jivamukti, taking full-time classes, and upper management position became available. And I applied for it.
At Jivamukti.
At Jivamukti, yeah. And I said, okay, here's who I am. Of course, Sharon and David knew me, but I still, we tried to take it seriously.
I have a recommendation.
Yeah, I have a recommendation. So I applied to them. They were the ones that were hiring. And they hired me, which was both the best and the worst thing. Before we started the recording, we talked a little bit about the overlap between what you're good at and what you're passionate about. And sometimes those two things don't always work well. But I found something that I thought was good and important, and that was a managerial role at Jivamukti. But not only was I not passionate about it, I'm also just not good at it. And
the limiting belief.
The limiting belief and the limiting results, yeah. And actually, so I became the general manager of 2 large locations with 150 teachers, 25, maybe more employees.
Wow.
And then I was at the same time the chief operating officer. And this is when they were really starting to expand. They opened up in Germany and in other places. And they were not in a good place because they were mismanaged before.
Mm-hmm.
And then I came on board with zero business experience, schooling. I mean, I'd been managing the front desk, which is like counting people's drawers, and like, but I knew nothing about marketing. I knew nothing about how to manage the rent and expenses, and no, I had no idea. And to be fair, they also should have never hired somebody with my experience.
Mm-hmm.
So we both made a mistake there. So this, but it put me in closer contact with the teacher training because I was then in charge of some aspects of the teacher training. And we got to a place where like, look, if you really want to understand, you have to take the teacher training.
Mm.
And in the preparation for it and getting ready for it, I realized that my strength is being with people. Not only is it my strength, but it's really my passion.
What you enjoy most.
What I enjoy most. And this is something that I reflect on now as I kind of question my yoga teaching life.
Mm-hmm.
If I reflect back at those times, as I was saying just now, like this kind of comparing, hanging out with my quote unquote non-yoga friends and my yoga friends, and the difference between those two and what caused me to go in either direction. If I reflect now on the later stages, what I realize is that Jivamukti in particular, yoga in general, satisfied something within me that I could potentially satisfy somewhere else. And that is the ability to not only be with people, but to be with ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not something that was so concrete for me until, I don't know, within the past couple of years, maybe. I really like exploring ideas, how things work, why things work. And it's what really drives me. And I don't, like, if I see things that could be done a little bit better, I want to know, oh, why isn't the person doing them this way? Which I think lets me be a really good teacher sometimes because I'm interested in doing things well. And well doesn't always mean the fastest or the strongest, but like, how does it work well for the person that I'm with? And there isn't really many more higher levels of complexity than being person to person, mind to mind, environment to environment with somebody and really exploring all of the different ideas that allows. And the exploration of those ideas is so fascinating to me. And because Jivamukti is interested in veganism and environmentalism and yoga philosophy and asana, which is anatomy, and how do these muscles work and how do those muscles work and how does this sutra relate to this? And it's like, that kind of mental masturbation, I find to be really exciting and enlivening for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think now that I can recognize that, it's given me a certain level of ease with teaching what I want to teach.
And I think also the structure was very helpful, right? This
Yeah.
whole system, this structure in it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Jivamukti structure also, it's a little bit like Sharon often's coming from a dance and a music background. Like once you know the notes, once you can play the scales, once you know the fingering, then you can really start to play. So the teacher training, like, okay, now I know all of these things. And I spent years getting really good at just doing what I was told in terms of like, what does somebody else think is a good class? What does somebody else think makes for a powerful idea or statement? Now, 20 something years later, I'm starting to figure out, how can I play this music on my own?
Yeah, filtering through your own brain and then spit it out again, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe come up with some kind of, oh my gosh, what's it called when simple forms give rise to complexity? This type of like, you don't know what's going to come. The building blocks are simple, but what comes out is seemingly random. It's like the beauty of what can come from the simplicity. Yeah.
And I think there comes also this individuality into play, right? It's like who you are as a person, and then there we maybe also come to this other subject, like well, it's not a totally different thing, but humor, for example. I think it's so nice to have humor in classes, and you also doing it in such a nice way always. How important is personality in a yoga class?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the yoga class, and it depends on the personality. Depends on the person on the receiving side. But I think, one thing that, do you know, I'm sure you do, Radhanath Swami. Yeah. Okay. So Radhanath Swami, I went to his temple in Mumbai. He gives class on a Sunday, Bhagavad Gita. Thousands of people show up for this guy. He goes on tour throughout the world. He has conversations with Obama when he was president and Dalai Lama, and he's meeting with all these powerful individuals. And he strikes up a friendship with Sharon because of Shamdas. Now, because I'm close with Sharon, we have this opportunity, and I'm spending time with Radhanath Swami. And he said something a couple of times that stood out to me. And he said, "Oh, what a wonderful personality you have." And I thought, that is such a weird ass compliment. Like, I couldn't imagine, because he's also from the States. So I knew it wasn't really like a language barrier. But I was like, what a nice personality you have. But he was making a point to compliment something. It was almost like saying, what a nice shirt that is. So he was making a distinction that seemed so out of left field for me, like so kind of, oh, wow, why is he doing that? That it caused me to think, it's like, wow, he sees it like an affectation. He doesn't see me as the same as my personality. And I think that's a very important reminder in this thing that we're doing. Because sometimes we take on the role of a teacher, and it causes us to speak, act, or behave in a way that we think a teacher should behave or act. Or changing the voice, changing the quality, which might be helpful. But when you identify as that thing, and you forget that there is something else, it can become tricky, because you have created a level of artifice in between what this other version of you, if you want to call it authentic version of you, or more authentic version of you, or less manicured version of you. You've created this other layer between you and the people you are interacting with. And although it could serve a purpose, and I think for many people it serves an incredible purpose, and for some people this is their whole teaching style. I mean, this is also how therapy works, right? Like, you don't give too much of yourself as the therapist, let's say as a speech therapist, speaking therapy. You don't want to give too much of yourself, but there's this kind of weird thing within a yoga practice where you want to be available to people, at least the type of yoga that I think is valuable to me and that I want to be involved in. There is this blend where we want to be available. We understand that we are all practitioners on this path, and that personality is a wonderful tool that we want to use and embrace, and it might be one of our strengths. But it shouldn't be synonymous with how we ought to behave. And there's a tricky thing, because if you were teaching a movement-based class that incorporates philosophical concepts, lifestyle suggestions, intimacy of movement and touch, you need some kind of clarity in your personality. And if that is not there, you probably won't have many people in your class. and maybe this type of teaching is not for you. And I always feel a little bit bad when I see somebody who enjoys a class. Oh my gosh, that class was amazing. I had so much fun. And then they want to teach and they want to teach like that.
Same way.
But it has nothing to do with who they are as a person.
Mm-hmm.
It's just something that they enjoy. And there is like maybe a false level of modesty when a teacher tells somebody else, like, yeah, you can be a yoga teacher. Well, have some discernment. Maybe not. Or maybe you could be a yoga teacher, but you're probably going to want to teach something a little slower.
Mm-hmm.
Same way, like, I used to work in construction also. I took a year break.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know that I could do any type of construction. No, not all construction is equal. Okay, you could be a dancer. Well, what kind of dance? A ballerina? No, I could not be a ballerina. So I think because there is a certain level of wanting to include people, we overlook certain things that are taken for granted, which are the compatibility of personality to the job that you're doing and to the receptivity of the people who are coming to your practice. And I think personality is super important for what I'm doing and for what I want to teach and for what I want to be involved in. If I'm not into the personality, then why would I be into the person? Why would I want to be engaged in a student-teacher or relationship in whatever form? Take it in the most superficial form. If I go to an aerobics class and the person is not if their voice bothers me, I just can't go. It's nothing personal.
Yeah.
Well, or to say it's 100% personal in my direction, but 0 personal to the other person.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's also like this theme of authenticity, right? To be authentic and not like playing a role.
Yeah.
Okay. So regarding this personality, authenticity, whatever, has a lot to do with each other. What do you think? Let's shorten this question.
Yeah.
What makes a good yoga teacher, in your opinion?
Okay, I have to think a little bit about maybe defining yoga first, because I have to admit I'm trying to be less judgmental and critical than I normally am, which leans towards the very much side. And I was listening to I didn't mean to listen to it. I was scrolling through something on Instagram and I passed by just a little snippet where a yoga teacher was answering a very similar question. And the person hadn't been teaching for very long. And so I was very impressed that somebody had the confidence to answer this question. And then I was trying to check my own criticalness, right? Like, how do I know what this person's history is, regardless of how long they've been teaching? But yoga, like many things, it seems like first and foremost, you need some kind of depth. Maybe there are some things that you don't need so much depth to teach. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but when I think about anything that has to do with how to live, which is yoga is very much concerned with how to live.
Like embodying.
Yeah, how to live well, how to live an examined life. What kind of questions to ask oneself, what kind of relationship to have with concepts surrounding truth and modes of life, investigation, self-reflection. This requires quite a bit of depth before you can share safely with others. And that is coming from somebody who shared maybe too much too soon. I did my teacher training when I was in, 2005. I was born in, so I was 23.
Mm-hmm.
And I was teaching right out of the gate. I almost think this is like somewhat irresponsible. And on top of that, I had already been practicing since I was 6. But if I look back, what I was trying to accomplish and kind of the mission of Jivamukti to share this lifestyle of yoga with people. And I'm there, 23 years old. It seems a bit strange because I had a lot of permission from people, maybe not necessarily Jivamukti, but from people, and particularly from myself, based on what I thought I was sharing. And so what do I look for? Maybe I can change your question a little bit, and instead of what makes a good teacher, I could say what I look for in a teacher. And what makes a teacher somebody that I want to spend time with, good to me, let's say. Somebody who has a certain level of depth, and that depth could come from a long time of practice and investigation. Maybe it comes from being with some kind of experience that I am not familiar with. Maybe, so I'm reading a lot now, Joan Halifax on being with dying and her work in hospice care. So
did she this book also? It's the one, the 5 things dying people regret the most. No,
I don't think she did that one, but I know the one that you're talking about. She does reference this in the book, in her book. So, even if somebody hasn't done this for a long time, it's something that I've really never done. So I'm also interested in somebody who's done something longer than me, because I'm interested what time has shown them. So depth, length of experience and exposure to the thing that they're going to teach me. And when it comes to yoga, there is a hope that they've had not only a depth of practice, but a depth of experience. Because really, part of what I'm interested is like learning how to read music. So I want somebody who can give me the notes that will help me to take the actions that will bring about a state of being. And I've come across a number of people who are good at the notation, but they haven't had the experience. And I think I've reached a place in my practice where that becomes evident pretty quickly, and I'm just not interested. And I don't have an interest anymore in learning so much like tips and tricks. I want to just be in a place that I can follow a simple and clear instruction, do the thing, and have an experience. Because if not, then I don't need a teacher right now. And I think most people don't really need a teacher. They need a community to practice.
Yeah.
And a teacher.
Keep practicing.
Yeah, to keep practicing, yeah. And it just so happens that as a kind of modern day yoga teacher, that's one of the main roles that I fulfill and that I look to have fulfilled. Somebody who can not only share something, but also is holding a space. So maybe I don't, have the greatest and best experience of my life, but they've created a space that's a social engagement at the same time to my quote unquote spiritual practice.
Okay, nice. And so regarding that, where do you take your inspirations from? Or are they, so you've been, what you mentioned in the beginning of our talk, with Shyam and all these people aren't there anymore. So are there still nowadays people that inspire you? Like you can get something from? Inspiration, I mean.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Get some drugs.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is really, for me, has always been something I try to cultivate, is that if I believe somebody has something to offer me, I will do whatever it takes to see that person. Now it's hard because I have a 3-year-old son and traveling is really a challenge. But I used to travel a lot and teach. And one time I went and taught at a yoga journal conference. And there was a teacher and whenever I'm there, I take as much as I can. And if I go to another yoga studio, I try to practice. And so I went and I took a class, and there was this guy there whose name is Adil Pakivala. And I didn't know, or maybe I'd seen him around, but I didn't really know who he was. I took his class. Amazing. I really enjoyed it. He taught all the way on the other side of the country. I'm in New York. He's outside of Seattle in Washington State. And I saw he was teaching a weekend workshop. And so I went. I just okay, it was in 2 months. Ananda Ashram in upstate New York. The place that was started by Sri Brahmananda Saraswati. There's a teacher there. Her name is Bharati. Bharati, she dressed in white. She's hardly ever leaves the ashram. She teaches Sanskrit classes 2-3 times a week. Sometimes I go. I'm the only person there.
Okay.
But I just decided I'm going to go and see this person every Wednesday. And I would then make an event. Who wants to come with me? I'd bring some students, some friends, and we would go up every Wednesday for a couple of months. So my feeling, and this is something that I try to remind myself, if you find somebody who captivates you, if I find somebody who captivates me, I stay with them until they no longer captivate me. And if that happens, maybe they continue to captivate me for a long time. But I don't like this idea of stick with the thing you know.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not interested in becoming... I teach Jivamukti and I practice Jivamukti, but I'm not so stuck with identifying as a Jivamukti teacher and a Jivamukti student. I'm a Jivamukti teacher and student because I'm interested in ideas and liberating ideologies wherever I may find them. And having the freedom to go outside maybe the accepted norm is going to be super important. And sometimes that includes other yoga teachers. Sometimes that includes things that aren't really yoga related. I had a really nice experience with a Rolfer. Do you know what a Rolfing is?
Rolfing? No.
Yeah, it's started by a woman named Ida Rolf. It's like one of the most German names I can think of from like the 30s. And I don't know if she was German, but she's lived in the States. And it's a type of myofascial release. Before myofascial release became as trendy as it is now. And I had a experience and I thought, wow, this is amazing. And then I just signed up for a residential thing somewhere in Bavaria where they were holding it for 2 weeks. And so I stayed there for 2 weeks and I learned, and I searched out, okay, this is interesting to me, but to what extent?
Mm-hmm.
And for anybody, I know you didn't ask me for advice, but this is one of the few places that I feel really secure about offering some kind of prescription, let's say. If you find somebody that captivates you or something and you have the ability to really investigate it deeply, do it. And then be willing to drop it just as quickly and to give it up. I think I've met a lot of people who are just stuck on the idea of becoming a specific thing that they lost or didn't get something else along the way. They weren't receptive to something else when it came and presented themselves.
Yeah. Wow. You just mentioned it that you, you traveled a lot. You're still traveling a lot. Now you have a child. And how does this change your practice or your lifestyle? I mean, I heard you traveled like 9 months a year. And how did this influence or challenged your lifestyle, practicing style, teaching style, whatever?
Yeah.
Art of living.
Art of living, yeah. My experience with yoga has often been to see it kind of described as a panacea. like a cure-all.
Mm-hmm.
You are neurotic? Try yoga. You have low blood pressure? Try yoga. You have back pain? Try yoga.
You want to get your ex back?
Yeah. You want to get like forever. You have like a terminal disease? Try yoga. It's really sometimes irresponsible.
Mm-hmm.
I have found later. In the beginning, I was like, oh yeah, try yoga. You got a missing a leg? Try yoga. And it was just so kind of, it was a lot. And as I said, I was in it from a very young age, so maybe I missed things that a skeptic or a doubter would see more immediately. And one of the things that changed in recent time that I'm grateful for is that having a little person, having a son, and being in a relationship with somebody, I remember sitting down with my partner and I said, look, you need to see a therapist.
To her?
Yeah. You're kind of like a wild person. I think you would benefit from therapy. I had never been to a therapist, right? So I was like the teacher that I said before, like knows the notes, but doesn't have the feeling. And so then she kind of like, wasn't into it and had gone that route before. And so I thought to myself, if I'm willing to give that advice, I need to be willing to take that advice. So I did, and I started doing this thing called EMDR. Are you familiar with EMDR? Yeah. So I started doing EMDR, in part because I didn't want too much talking, because I can talk circles around myself. I wanted something that was a little bit more physical. I had already read The Body Keeps Score with Bessel van der Kolk.
Yeah.
And I'm very much into embodied therapeutic processes. And so I started doing EMDR with somebody who was recommended to me.
I never did it. Is it good?
I really enjoyed it. Now, I say really enjoyed it, but half of it is really uncomfortable and terrible memories and thoughts and crying, but also very liberating. And because it was physically based, and because so much of what I did was a quasi or wanting to be some kind of psychological, physical healing modality, yoga, I was receptive to it. So I don't know if it works for everybody. It really worked for me and was helpful for me. And I must have done like 20 sessions. Like it felt like a substantial number of times.
How long is one session?
An hour.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I did like 20 sessions, took a break. And then I did a few more sessions, take a break, and did this. And I just realized that I think to kind of go back to the heart of what you were asking, how's my yoga practice changed with these things? Because I had other requirements. The requirement now was to be a father and to be a husband. I had different needs for myself. And other things were needed from me. And I thought, okay, how can I complement yoga instead of how can I make yoga the only thing? And my experience is most people come to yoga as a complement to other things. They're injured, they're seeing a physical therapist, and the physical therapist says, why don't you try yoga? They're having some emotional things and they're going to a psychologist, and the psychologist says, you know what, you should move, but maybe a cardio class is too intense for you. Why don't you try a yoga class? Or they're already in philosophy and they want something philosophical, but they also want to move their body and so, right? So usually yoga is what most people add on. And for me, it was the opposite. And so I realized that I could add on to my yoga practice, and my yoga practice would benefit from just like some proper emotional and psychological healing that was missing, although kind of couched in some of the phrasing and the work and chakra healing, and you're gonna purify these relationships you've had with, and some of that might be true. But what I needed was to deal with some of the actual trauma that was still within my system that yoga bypassed in a way. Yeah, so that, I don't know if that answers your question exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, that's the scene is speaking a lot about it, like bypassing, right? In yoga, you get these like verbal receipts, receipts, recipes, and then as you mentioned, just heal your chakra, manipura, and then everything is come, and then you're done. But I don't know if there's something like, I don't want to say like like someone who's like a doctor who said, okay, now you're healed. There's nothing like that.
Yeah. There's nothing like that, but it's given as if that were the case. So nobody at the end says, okay, now you're pure, now your chakras are purified. But at the beginning, they say, this will do it. But then there's no way to test. Like,
Yes,
did it
that's
work?
what I mean, yeah.
Yeah, there's like, how do I know? Well, one way that I knew was that I was still kind of bumping up against the same obstacles. I was still in certain relationships quick to anger. No matter how many times I said blessings, thankfulness, and love to my partners, like that was helpful. That was like a good first step. And maybe that's all somebody needs, but I needed more than that. And enlightenment doesn't seem to be the rule. It seems to be the exception. And so in a perfect world, you could say, meditate on the I am, the sense that appears upon wakening, that you are, before any descriptors. I am tired, I am man, I am one, but just concentrate on the I am, and your essential nature, one with the universe, will be revealed to you. That sounds really nice. But I have met almost no one in that place. But I've met a lot of people who say that and then seem to have this other space where they are tremendously unhappy.
Yeah.
And often what they are teaching is the thing that they need the most. So when somebody comes to me and says, oh, you're going to be able to resolve all your relationships, the first red flag that comes up to me is a question of like, I wonder what their relationships are like.
Mudra into the face.
Yeah. What are your parents? Well, like, do you still blame your parents for things? Are you still like trying to fix things with your kids? Like, because that's why somebody might want to go there in the first place. And it might
this pretension of, I made it. I'm ready. I'm not a work in progress anymore.
Yeah. So this is the thing that concerns me sometimes. But it's also true that I believe, or maybe I shouldn't say that it's true. It's true that I believe. It seems to be the case that people have profound experiences of unity, of non-conceptual reality, of incredible sense of community without boundary and love. But then they come back into their body in the world and they can't integrate. And something is blown in them in a way that doesn't seem to make their life or the life of the people around them better. No, of course, I'm saying that from the outside. So I'm not in their being. But if they still have a body and they still need food and they still need clothes and shelter, and they've done something that makes all of those things much harder for them, like they can't keep a job anymore because they're up floating around somewhere, or they're only going from one retreat to the next and one teacher to the next, and they're not able to ground themselves at all. Oh man, I don't want a job that's going to bring me down. Like, then I don't know how that's not the place I want to be. And that's not the place that I want to bring people as a teacher, whatever it is I'm teaching. I'm not sure that's where I want people to go with what I'm offering.
Yeah.
So there's these two things. You could bypass it, and I think you could have profound experience regardless of what your parents or your children or your job. I think all that is true. But I think in the state of mind that I am now, that's not interesting to me. nor is it interesting to me to be in a place where I'm still having the hurt and wanting to overcome the hurt and forget about that ultimate sense of reality. That's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to believe that both of those things are somewhere in the realm of possibility. And if they're not in the realm of possibility, if they're just archetypes, if they're just ideals, then I think those are wonderful ideals to hold simultaneously. To work on being a healed person and working on being a whole person.
Yeah. I mean, it's in the Gita, right? When Arjuna just wants to abandon this world, and Krishna says, "Hey, you stay here, you work on this stuff, and just be part of this world."
Totally. Yeah, definitely.
You're also doing this nice thing online. It's called Liberation Lab. Can you tell a bit more about that? I was into it already. It's really beautiful, and what you offer over there, especially for people who can't, because you're even here in Berlin, you're not so many times. Then you're gone again. So people who want to practice with you, I think it's a perfect opportunity.
Yeah, thanks. All right, so Liberation Lab started, I think, at the same time that many online yoga things started, the beginning of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Previous to that, 9 to 10 months of the year traveling around the world, mostly between Europe and Asia. Then all of a sudden, lockdown, couldn't go anywhere. And I jumped in line and started teaching. I've learned a lot since then. But the core of what I wanted to do has remained the same, I think. So the name is Liberation Lab, as you said. And it is soteriological in nature, meaning it's concerned at its core with ideas surrounding liberation. Now, I don't mean liberation strictly in the religious sense of liberation from ego, liberation from the world, and then you ascend into heaven. Although those could be ideas about that we cover in Liberation Lab, but it could be liberation from specific ways of thinking and engaging in the world that cause us harm and perpetuate cycles of violence and destruction. So how do we do this? We have not so much asana, really. We have once a week an asana class. And because we've been doing it for a long time and we've been building a library, we have over 350 classes library of mostly good quality. I think I have to go through and delete some of them. Then we have once a month a satsang where we get together and we talk about different ideas. And the ideas have a very big range. So we had, and we also have a book club, and sometimes the two overlap. And so we had the power of metaphor, how metaphor is adopted in our language, and looking at, we spent like just 1 hour talking about directions as metaphor in language, as in, I'm feeling up today, or I'm feeling down. Okay, your direction hasn't changed, but what is it about our feeling and our experience in the world that across cultures we can say up in relation to an emotion and it makes sense? And then how do we orientate ourselves around the understanding of metaphor? We had a book club revolving around a book, Deep Green Resistance, which is very critical of kind of yoga and veganism movements, because they revolve around this idea of kind of, we like to say, as Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see. And they say it's a little bit lazy, actually, because you're not addressing systemic change. And really, you're not going to change the world without systemic change. We're not going to change by adopting new light bulbs. We're going to change by looking at industry and making sure politicians are held accountable for the actions that they are taking, and then also being critical of things like greenwashing, which is kind of popular now. So when we say Liberation Lab, the lab is experimental. We talk about our ideas. We engage actively. So we do letter writing campaigns. We are discussing, okay, what I have a friend in Spain who's working with Buddhism and environmentalism, or used to be Fridays for Future, had some kind of foothold here in Germany. And so we would encourage people to go out and participate in Fridays, Future for Fridays, Friday Future. DM25, this political European-wide group, engaging with them and going to some of their demonstrations and meetings. So yeah, how do we experiment with ideas that are liberatory? That is to say, liberating us from unnecessary suffering, liberating us from limiting ideologies, as somebody I know likes to say, liberating us from the tyranny that is imposed on us by the way that our governments might work and the structures that we have just agreed with are okay. And maybe we're not aware, like what are the civilizational ills that we're perpetuating? So that's my hope. And it's growing and refining itself every day. It's a conversation, and I'm willing to collaborate with anybody who has a similar interest. So
beautiful.
Thanks.
And also when you say talk about Sangha and everything, it's also like this idea, what you mentioned before, that you don't find it so much in studios that people can connect with each other. So they can put their...
I mean, it's not a huge group, but it is a very regular group. And, we all know each other, and it's very international. So, last Sunday, we had somebody from Beirut, somebody from Bavaria, I'm in Germany, somebody from New York, somebody from Paris, somebody from Spain. It's harder with the live things for the Southern Hemisphere people. Yeah, so a lot of them, we used to have people at like 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning showing up, but that's not so sustainable. But then we meet in person once in a while, and it's always we always make it available for anybody. Money should not be a limiting factor. So we offer it. We have scholarship options that range from almost free to 50%. And then there are some people who pay a little bit extra so that somebody else can come for less.
Beautiful. And they can find it on Liberation Lab?
Yeah, we're on Instagram, Liberation Lab. You can find us there. Just Google Liberation Lab, you'll find us. Yeah.
We put it also in the show notes.
Nice.
To click. What I also wanted to ask, just a small one. Do you call yourself still Hip Hop Asana? Is it still the name, or was it?
If you Google Hip Hop Asana, it'll probably come up.
Or shall we cancel? Shall we cancel it?
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Fine.
So you also, was it very important for you to bring the hip hop culture also into the yoga world?
For a while, I would say reverse. It was important for me to bring yoga into the hip hop culture. Maybe that's not the right way to emphasize it exactly, but I'll tell you the short version of it. Came out of teacher training. I have this background, as I discussed already earlier in the podcast. But I have this group of friends that I want to come, but this is not a super inviting place for them.
With the mantras.
With the mantras and also, like, okay, I was in a probation center. I want to bring yoga to the probation center because they can't really go somewhere else. And to be honest, I wouldn't be responsible for like 10 young people who are going back and forth to court. Do I want to bring them on a field trip? No. So I would prefer to go to where they are. But if I show up and do yoga as I know it in Jivamukti, to this kind of, let's say, upwardly mobile, middle class, experimental, they're already confident with some of these ideas, it wouldn't work. So I figured, what can I do to make yoga accessible?
It's a question anyways, right? Nowadays, yoga gets so expensive. And not these people, they can't afford it, really.
Definitely. Yeah, and so I figured it's on me to make it accessible. And so I went to places that I knew. And I went back to my old high school and I went to this program that I had gone through when I was on probation, and I started to teach with just hip hop instrumental music, a little bit fast paced, like a little bit more than a vinyasa practice, because breath awareness, like all of this everything is new. So if I took the approach, if we get moving first and break things down later, that would be better. And then that grew to programs. And I started to teach like an 8-week program at a place called The Door, which is another, I don't know how they describe themselves, maybe a youth development program, but they're a place often for people who are not working so well in the public school system. And they have a large gay and transgender community because they're often the ones in conflict. They're having to fight in school. So they're kicked out for fighting, but they're fighting in part because they're defending themselves. And so I would teach there an 8-week program, and then they would teach their community, right? Still in there at the door, and a homeless shelter. And so I started teaching at these places, but it was all for free. And this was not sustainable for me. So I figured, okay, I'm doing all this. It seems to be going all right. How can I use the connection in the other direction, hip hop to yoga, to generate some income and awareness about what I'm doing? And luckily for me, Russell Simmons, who's kind of like the godfather of hip hop, Def Jam. He's one of the founders of Def Jam. His brother is Reverend Run from Run DMC, and got groups like LL Cool J and the Beastie Boys, and Def Jam Records, and Def Poetry, Def Jam, comedy, Def Comedy. So he's like the man.
And he also wrote this book, Think Rich or something like that.
He wrote a couple of books.
His career on the Bhagavad Gita and stuff.
Yeah.
He also was mentioned Jivamukti method that he got a big influence of.
Yeah, he's very open with his influence from Jivamukti. He practiced there for like 20 years every day. And so collaborated with him a little bit. He got some spaces. But, oftentimes people with money, they don't give you money. They give you time. And then you use their time to kind of get funding from other places. And so I started to teach a thing that I called hip hop asana. And hip hop asana was a way for me to generate revenue so that I could either bring yoga mats or pay for my own time to teach in these other places. And I started to teach them at Jivamukti first. And the way it worked was essentially Jivamukti open class. So think 90 minutes open class. And instead of, at this time I was playing CDs, but instead of CDs, a DJ came and spun vinyl.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And so that was every class we had a DJ spinning hip hop vinyl. And hip hop vinyl meant everything that maybe contemporary people would define as hip hop, but everything that influenced hip hop. So ska, rock and roll, funk, jazz, reggae, as long as it kind of fit the yoga class theme and structure. And then we would have some kind of hip hop element. So we might have a spoken word artist come. I used to work a little bit with a beatboxer. And so the beatboxer would come and do something that was, we called it percussive pranayama. So teach people how to beatbox in the beginning. Instead of Surya Namaskar, my brother's a break dancer. And so he would sometimes come and teach break dancing instead of Surya Namaskar. And so if by the end, people would know a routine, like a break dance routine. Sometimes I had performers come, because performance is also a big part of kind of hip hop culture. And so I had people who were dancing like on the train and doing like these amazing sets. And I say, look, I'll pay you this amount to come and be a part of this thing. We're doing this show. And so that's the way that it happened. And so then I started doing that at Jivamukti. That grew to conferences. People really enjoyed that. And that's how it grew, let's say. But then at a certain point, I felt like I was doing more of that than I was at the programs. Because I was traveling, I didn't have as much time to be there. And it felt more like in those places, I was kind of bringing hip hop to a non-hip hop community. And that wasn't my interest. My interest was to bring yoga to a non-yoga community, which was a hip hop community, which is I was a part of. And now it felt a little bit like I'm not a hip hop teacher. I'm a yoga teacher, and I don't want to be teaching hip hop. And so maybe it comes back at some point if I find the right moment to do it and vibe and organization. Then that would be nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But nice idea.
Thanks.
It's really nice. And so Russell Simmons, he also went to your classes, right?
Tons. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I know him well. Like,
how was it for you? When you saw him the first time, he was.
In the beginning, it was, it was amazing. I thought this is so cool, but I mean, he wasn't the only one who came. Now he's trending. Puffy came to class.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Puffy. Russell gave me so many opportunities. He connected me to Naomi Campbell, who I taught privately for a while. Heidi Klum would come to class. We did class in the park with Heidi. He would always bring people, and so he's a very super generous and very influential. And so sometimes people would like want a meeting with him. I'm like, okay, let's talk after yoga, but I'm not going to meet with you unless you come to yoga. So he would just bring random people. So it was super cool. Yeah, and he's very kind and very generous. We do Instagram lives together still sometimes. We talk on the phone from time to time. Yeah.
Sounds great. Cool.
Yeah, he's really sweet guy.
You just mentioned this book that you're doing on your book club.
Yeah.
What did draw you to this subject, like death? I mean, it's a subject we speak in our Western world not so much about it. In India, it's more present in the lives of these people, but we in the Western world, we don't do it that much. What did draw you to that?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of some people that were important in my life, particularly Sharon, had always remarked on the potency of the experience in her life of being with people as they passed. And although it is not particularly a yoga text, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, or the Tibetan Book of Death, is something that has also been in and out of my sphere of interest, let's say. But one thing that really brought my attention to it in the recent, not too distant past, I have an apartment in New York that is called a co-op. I don't know what you would call it here in Germany, like a Genossenschaft, maybe? Like where people all kind of live together, but they own the building together.
Oh, yeah.
So, but it's not like a developer and then I buy it from the developer. It's like we come together and we own the building together. And it's meant to keep it kind of affordable, So, and there was a woman, Audrey. There was a woman, Audrey, who lived on the second floor, and her husband, Tommy. Have you spent time in New York?
No.
All right, so they are very much what I think of like classical New York. I mean, they have a beautiful love story. They met in a methadone clinic. Do you know what a methadone clinic is? Yeah, for like getting off heroin. Yeah. And she kind of talks like this, like a chain smoker and used to do a lot of drugs and hard life. And Audrey, Tommy, and he was on an oxygen tank, still smoke, like chain smoking. I'm gonna blow up this guy,
Yeah.
And she was not old, late 50s, early 60s, but you would swear she was ancient. But she was so sweet. And Tommy was a very kind of, they're both sweet in their own way, but it could be easy to be rubbed the wrong way by Tommy. And so I didn't spend a whole lot of time with them, but we see each other. And then I started sending them postcards when I traveled. I really like to send postcards.
Sweet,
yeah. And I don't know if they even ever left the city, in their life. And so I would send them postcards. And to other people in this Genossenschaft, in this co-op. And then Audrey, for the second time, was diagnosed with throat cancer.
Mm.
And the first time she had throat cancer, she did all the steps and was okay. And then
It's like therapy, also.
chemo, radiation, surgery, did everything. She also didn't live a very healthy lifestyle for however long, like almost her whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And then it came back.
Mm-hmm.
And like her respiration was very diminished. Like she couldn't breathe well. So she was often on a oxygen tank. Yeah, oxygen tank mask. So she really couldn't leave the apartment at a certain point. And Tommy, who was also on oxygen tank, but was still kind of taking care of her or of each other, he fell out of the bed or something, broke his hip, and then had to be in the hospital.
Mm.
And they were not sure how long that was going to be. And so I started to spend time with her, and she was deteriorating super quickly. And we would do all kinds of fun things. So we would she was very self-conscious, and she really only wore like a hospital shift, So we would take photos together. She really liked wrestling, like WWF wrestling. So I'd watch wrestling with her, and she'd be like, oh, like get him. Like so into it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd cook food sometimes. It was hard because I still had to travel every once in a while. And she had a nurse who came 2 or 3 hours in a day, not much, just enough to kind of clean up a little bit, make sure she was alive, like to do a wellness check, and then she'd kind of leave. Spent a good amount of time with her, and she got progressively worse. Maybe worse is not the right word, but she was getting closer and closer to death until I left, and like 2 days after I left, she passed away. And yeah, we know for sure. Yeah. Because she had been hospitalized once or twice. And so it just happens like I look over and her lips are blue because she's not getting any oxygen. Then we do the tank. And then, but she's not always aware of it. She kind of like starts to fade off. And so everybody knew that it was pretty close. But we became very, very close to each other. She had a daughter that she hadn't seen in, 20 years, who she finally got in contact and was going to come and visit. And she said, Jules, please, I want you to stay here and be here when my daughter comes. So we really we had this. So to go back to your question, I realized not just, okay, there's the potency of the moment of death. Fine. The transmigration of the soul, if you want to call it that. But I found that she wasn't, and I didn't have to be so preoccupied that we could really get close quickly. And it was so nice for me. It was so beautiful because it was also felt like a real act of service. So there was a certain level of selfishness there because I could really be there for somebody, and there was somebody there who was willing for me to be there, knowing that I was there as an act of service for them. And she wasn't like, oh, I don't want you to see me this way. I don't want to be like this. Every once in a while that cropped up. But I just think of some of the people in my life who I would like to be there when they're at the end of their life. I don't know if they would let me. Like they might feel like they need to be strong.
Yeah.
They might feel embarrassed. Who knows what I would feel, but my assumption is that not so much. But this person knew that they were at the end of their life, and I got to be there for that. But otherwise, as you mentioned before, she would be an anonymous person with an anonymous nurse, mostly alone most of the day. And that, to me, is very sad. That's way sadder than the thought of death. And this work that we're doing, this work that Joan Halifax has been doing with this book, I don't know how much it speaks to that, but she worked in end-of-life care, in hospice care. So this is more so than the moment of death and what happens after death and just at the moments and where's the soul. Like those things could be really interesting to me if I experience them. But what's more interesting to me is being with people who are dying. And I would like to know more how to do that. We live in a world where, China is a wonderful example. They have an incredible aging population compared to their younger population. The States as well. And my mom is the primary caretaker of her mom, who's 96. And I see her struggle because not only is she losing somebody she loves, but she has no idea. Maybe she does now, but in the beginning, she had no idea how to be with somebody who's dying, other than a good intention. But that might not be enough.
No. Yeah, I think there was one book of Ram Dass. I think it's called Path to God or something like that. He's also
He did a lot of work with
yeah, and there's a big chapter in it, like how to be with persons who are about to die and everything. Wow, yeah. And so this book is all about it, right? And the one
It's the only thing it's about.
Okay, wow, amazing.
Being with Dying, I think is the name of the title, and it talks about her work as in a spiritual practice, being with people who are aware that they are close to the time of death.
Okay. And it's this Sunday? No, next Sunday. This Sunday.
It's May 5th.
May 5th. On the Liberation Lab. Okay.
Yeah.
We put the link in the show notes. And
all right. I think I'm very happy that you invited me here.
I'm happy to have had you here.
To be a part of this and to witness. We don't really know each other very well. We've seen each other a couple of times in class. So it's wonderful to get to know you and see the projects that you're involved in and getting wet and all of these fun ideas.
Thank you so much. Already looking forward to participate in your class again, hopefully soon, if my leg allows me.
and maybe understanding what the practice could look like without the leg cooperating.
Yeah, but in class it's hard, I guess.
Yeah. But that's the thing about Liberation Lab. We have a lot of somatic education classes, which require very little to no movement. Yeah,
and that's perfect. I will get into it for sure. Thank you so much, Jules.
Pleasure.
This was our podcast with Jules Febre, Advanced Jivamukti teacher, and yes, what could I say, a legend himself. If you want to join him on his retreats, workshops, classes, or his Liberation Lab, then check out all the links in the show notes. And if you want to show your appreciation for this episode, please jump over to iTunes or Spotify and leave a 5-star review. This helps a lot to spread this message of the podcast to even more souls out there. Thank you, and hear you soon.